Hello, I'm Adam Hart, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about citizen science, partnerships for discovery. And I'm based here at the University of Gloucestershire. I'm actually in the prep room here at the back of the biosciences labs at the university. So if you see anyone going by, that's what we're doing. We're getting ready for the students coming back. Okay, so citizen science, what is it? Let's define our term first of all. The first one is pretty easy, science. Although actually it's a very good way of putting someone on the spot. Actually, it can be quite hard to realize what science is. Science is fundamentally just the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural world following a systematic method that's based on evidence. And at the heart of that is that five-step scientific method. So you observe something about the natural world, you ask questions about it, why does this occur? You formulate a hypothesis, an idea for why it occurs, which comes up with certain predictions, which you can then test with an experimental or perhaps an observational approach. That's fundamentally what science is, a very powerful tool for understanding the world. If we think about citizens, the other side of that citizen science thing, we've got a native or an inhabitant of a particular place. So by combining together this idea, we start to formulate the notion that citizen science is about citizens, the public, helping scientists with particular research questions. And the term citizen science is very widely said to have been first coined by an academic called Rick Bonney in the United States and Alan Irwin in the UK in the mid-1990s. Irwin's definition is a little bit different, I think, from what most people's understanding of citizen science is now. Irwin was talking about developing concepts of scientific citizenship which foregrounds the necessity of opening up science and science policy processes to the public. So Irwin in the UK was coming at this citizen science idea much more from the perspective of the public being more involved in the process of science, including perhaps the funding of science, the idea of open access publishing, and that kind of thing, which is a very interesting aspect. But actually now what we think of when we think of citizen science is more Rick Bonney's definition, which is projects in which non-scientists, such as amateur birdwatchers, voluntarily contribute scientific data. And that, I think, is really our understanding of citizen science now. That's really what we're dealing with. This idea of a partnership between non-scientists and scientists working together, where scientists are, if you like, taking advantage of certain organizations or certain groups of people that are able to feed data in. That's all very well, but as often happens when you start chasing through the papers and you start looking at the history of things, actually it's not quite as straightforward as that. I found, for example, a mention of citizen science way back here in the late 70s, where it's talking about ufology or ufology, the study of UFOs. And here James Oberg says, if ufology is not a science, what then is it? It might be considered as a protest movement against the impersonality and specialization of modern science, which has all but eliminated the role of the citizen scientist, the amateur investigator, who in the past contributed substantially to the development of science through part-time dabbling. Several really important words there, one of which is amateur. We think of amateur often in quite a pejorative way, but actually amateur means someone who loves a topic. In this country, for example, we have a whole range of amateur entomologists, absolute phenomenal experts in particular insect groups that can identify all manner of very weird and wonderful creatures, but do so effectively without taking pay. They're not doing it in a professional sense. So the word amateur is a very important concept within this. Darwin was an amateur scientist in a great deal of respects. Most of the work that he was doing at Down House, he wasn't being paid to do it. He didn't have a research grant to sort of do these things in the modern way that we might accept. So the amateur investigator, the part-time dabbler, is really a very important part of the history of science. And what Oberg's kind of referring to here is a sort of mix of Irwin and Rick Bonney's approaches, which is the idea of opening up science. And I think that's a really important component of what we're going to be talking about as well, is that this idea of citizen science and of people contributing data is a form of opening up science. So both of these kind of areas lend into this sort of approach. So how can we define it? Well, lots of people working in citizen science sort of tie themselves up in knots a little bit about how we define it. And there's lots of different definitions, but mostly they all kind of follow one of these sorts of three broad definitions, which is that citizen science is a research collaboration. That's an important component, the fact that it's research performed by untrained, amateur, although we've seen the problems with that word, or non-expert individuals. That's one idea of it. The other idea is this involvement of volunteers in science, and we'll see projects where actually we ask rather a lot of our volunteers. And then the third perspective is this idea of public participation in scientific research. And if we combine these things together, we end up with the sort of definition where we have scientific partners working with members of the public, or in some cases the whole public, mass participation, in some cases very specialized subsets of the general public, that let us work together to create knowledge to undertake research. So let's have a little look through a few schemes just to get an idea for what sort of projects we're talking about. This is quite a long-running scheme, which absolutely can be considered as citizen science. It's the British Trust for Ornithology, the BTO's Nest Record Scheme. Now, this is a really interesting example of citizen science because this is something that anyone can take part in, but actually involves really quite a large amount of investment of time and of effort, because what the BTO Nest Record Scheme asks people to do is to find and follow the progress of individual birds' nests, and it provides some online training for doing that, and it collects some incredibly valuable data, and much of the information that we know about Britain's birds and breeding success and so on, a huge amount of it comes from schemes like this and comes from amateurs, from volunteers, from members of the public who may have a very special interest and perhaps also some skills involved in measuring these things, but they're not being paid. They're not a formal part of any biological research grant or any particular biological department, but they are nonetheless contributing hugely valuable data. Then we've got things like the National Amphibian and Reptile Recording Scheme, which, as you might expect, looks at the records and the abundance and diversity of amphibians and reptiles across the UK using surveying techniques. And again, really quite specialist skills and knowledge, but using members of the public to provide these information. And there's all sorts of help and all kinds of things involved. So it's almost building up this sort of extended research network between scientists that are overseeing the surveys and groups of individuals that are overseeing the survey and the individuals that are out there in the field collecting the data. And then you've got other surveys as well. Butterfly conservation run the big butterfly count and various other things, which, although require perhaps less skill than things like a Nest Record Scheme, still require you to be able to identify butterflies, to be able to follow protocols properly, and to be able to perform those surveys. So it isn't just a case of wandering around, seeing perhaps a single natural phenomenon, as we'll talk about later with things like house spiders or flying ants, and recording it. Actually, these types of schemes require a little bit more of an investment in terms of skill and knowledge, and I would argue also actually give the people that are involved in this a lot more engagement, a lot sort of more of a sense of satisfaction. It's a really kind of satisfying thing to be involved in this sort of work. And then there's lots of other organisations as well, things like Bee Wars, the Bee Wasp Recording Society. They have amateur but extremely skilled people that are involved in identifying and recording the presence and absence of all kinds of bees, wasps and ants. There's an awful lot of species out there, an awful lot of different groups. Likewise, the Spider and Harvestman Recording Scheme. Harvestmen, they look like Smarties with very long legs. They're closely related to spiders but aren't. If you want to find a Harvestman, just pitch a tent and then look inside. It seems to be the most reliable way of finding one. We've also got the National Moth Recording Scheme, lots of other recording schemes throughout the country. And these recording schemes rely on volunteers, but they rely on some of the knowledge of those volunteers, so a certain amount of brain power, and they also rely on time. So that type of citizen science scheme relies on, in some cases, I think it's fair to say, some very expert people giving up their time and giving up their efforts. But other types of citizen science schemes, and perhaps the ones that attract most attention, are the mass participation citizen science schemes, where scientists ask many people across the country, ideally even everyone, to take part and to get involved. And the first scheme that I became aware of when I was a child, actually watching this on Blue Peter, and one of the most successful and longest running of these citizen science schemes was actually the UK Ladybird Survey, which was started by this gentleman here, Mike Majerus, who I first saw on the television when I think I was about 6 or 7, and actually then became my undergraduate project supervisor at one point when I was at university. And he set up the Ladybird Survey, and really it was to try and get much more information about the distribution of UK ladybird species across the country. And it seems rather quaint now, but the UK Ladybird Survey initially asked people to fill in a survey, a paper-based survey, which went inside an envelope, and you plonked a stamp on it and you sent it off, and they were able to build up these distribution maps based on the data that were coming in, and if they got unusual data points, they were able to send people out to try and verify them and so on. And by doing this, they built up really an incredible database, which continues to this day through the UK Ladybird Survey, and lets us get a far better grasp on where these insects are than we would be able to otherwise. And this type of citizen science, yes, it does rely on people volunteering, and it does rely on a certain amount of time and a certain amount of sort of mental engagement, if you like. But really what it's taking advantage of is the ubiquity of the general public. The large numbers of people that are out there covering the ground. As we've seen in lots of citizen science projects now, of course, the British public don't cover the ground uniformly. Very often when you're mapping species abundance, for example, you're also to a certain extent mapping people, but you can control for some of these things. But it absolutely is taking advantage of the fact that people can be in lots and lots of places at lots of times, which just wouldn't be possible for you as an individual scientist or even as a group of scientists to get that level of coverage. And that's really a crucial thing with some of the sort of larger citizen science projects, and certainly some of the ones I've been involved with. We're really trying to get that coverage and that scope out there in the natural world. All kinds of surveys. Let's just have a look at a few. Some of these are live now and you can get involved with them. Some of them are historical, but they show the sort of sweep of projects that people get involved with. So there's Project Budburst, for example. This is a phenology project. So phenology is the study of timing of natural events. Very interesting from an ecological perspective, from a biological perspective, and of course also now from the sort of global change biology perspective, the idea of climate change. Very important to look at the phenology, the timing of things like, for example, the first buds. We get the timing of fruits, we get the timing of the first emergencies of bumblebees, and all kinds of other projects that are linked to phenology that are really interesting to get involved with. This time of year also we have phenological projects to do with autumn, which are really interesting. We've also seen a rise in projects that are involved with things like plants and diseases. Here, for example, there's a whole series of projects that are involved with looking at ash dieback. There are similar projects looking at diseases in horse chestnuts, looking at insect pests in different plants. And again, it's very useful because if you're a scientist and you're interested, for example, in ash dieback, well, you can go around and survey the country, but it's hugely expensive and time consuming. And in reality, your coverage is going to be fairly slight, even with a large team. Whereas if you have thousands of people out there in the wider world keeping their eye out for these sorts of signs and able to report back and give you those data, it's a much more efficient way of doing it and a much more effective way of doing it. And these projects can be really very successful. Some of these projects can, on the face of it, be a little bit more fun. You think Project Splatter, what's all that about? And then you read it and you think, oh, it's actually about roadkill. Very important project, because what we know is that lots of animals, here we've got an otter, lots of animals, birds and mammals particularly, but also reptiles, succumb to road casualties. They succumb to sort of traffic accidents, if you like, being hit by cars and being run over. And trying to find out the patterns, which species, which times of year, which times of day, which roads. Trying to get on top of that is actually allowing the people behind Project Splatter to come up with all kinds of really cool ways to mitigate that problem and to understand a little bit more. So that's a live project, actually, Project Splatter. If you do see roadkill, I mean, it's hard not to see roadkill when you drive around. They want to know. They want to know what it is, where you were, and other information that links into that national database. And again, not something that you could really do as an individual scientist or even as a large group, because you're just not covering the road network thoroughly. Invasive plants and invasive animals actually as well are particularly amenable to this type of approach, again because of that ubiquity of people. So if you're out for a walk, for example, and you see Himalayan balsam or you see Japanese knotweed or other plants, you can report that through Plant Tracker, which is linked up to the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and they will monitor and keep a handle on all of these things and look to try and mitigate some of the problems that these plants are causing. So invasive animals and invasive plants are particularly popular with citizen science projects. And really key to all of these projects that we've just been looking at is that the project itself is led by professional scientists, but there is the potential for mass participation from the public. But quite often with these sorts of projects, there is a relatively simple and straightforward task. So it's not like being able to identify all of the British butterflies, for example, or being involved in the Nest Records scheme. It's more of a case of, well, here's what an invasive plant looks like when you're out for a walk. If you see one, go onto this app, upload the information, and that's all great. So very little training, sometimes a little bit, but very little required for the participants. And in some cases, actually raising awareness of particular things or educating the public about certain aspects can be as important as the science in many cases. And it's certainly a very good springboard. I did a citizen science project looking at flying ants, for example, and we had flying ant emergencies being recorded over 3 years. And it gave us a tremendous platform to start talking about how important ants were. And actually, yes, they can be a little bit annoying, but have you considered how important they are for aerating your soil, for example, or how important they are as part of the ecological food webs that go on, not just in your back garden, but across the wider ecosystem. I'm involved at the moment in a project called the Big Wasp Survey, where we have partnerships with about 1,500 samplers throughout the country who, for a short period of time, following a very specific protocol, trap wasps at their wasp location, identify them and send us the data. That, in terms of the participation, is relatively small. We don't want that many people involved, but in terms of giving us a platform to talk to people about just how important wasps are and how misunderstood they are, that's a tremendous platform that we wouldn't get if we didn't have this angle of collecting the science as well. So something that I find really interesting as a science communicator and as a researcher is just how well citizen science gels those two aspects together, particularly if you've got species that people are either scared of perhaps, or wary around, or they don't like, or they absolutely love. The two sides of the two ends of the spectrum are quite useful. When you've got organisms in the middle, actually, that people are fairly neutral about, that can be harder to generate that sort of hook. And so, yeah, when you're involved with citizen science, you sort of get involved in a bit of marketing and public relations and things. You have to kind of think about how you're going to pitch your project, because you're trying to get people to give up even a small amount of their time to help you. So you have to give them a good sales pitch, or they're just not going to. If we look at citizen science in science and look across science, and we search for that, you can see on this graph here, I suspect, I'm not sure how this is going to play, that my face is covering the end of the axis. That says sort of just about here, if it's lined up properly, says 2020. We've seen this huge acceleration of citizen science, both in the title of papers and also in the topics that's covered. Two trends really. First of all, this very big rise from about 2009, 2010, and also a drop-off in the number of papers that have citizen science in the title as opposed to the topic, because as citizen science becomes embedded as an approach, it's no longer necessary for us as scientists to sort of have it in the title. It's like, yeah, we use citizen science to do this. That's sort of the point of those projects early on. But now it's like, yeah, we did this thing, and embedded in the methods is the fact we use citizen science. Citizen science as an approach has become normalized within a huge amounts of many areas of science, particularly, for instance, in ecology, in a relatively short period of time, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And that's also interesting because we see this big rise. How do we account for it? It's very, very simple. In our pockets, we all now carry extremely powerful computers that enable us to connect with specialist apps, social media apps, and the internet on the move in a very, very straightforward way. And this sort of Web 2.0, and in particular the adoption and very widespread penetrance of smartphones now from about 2010 onwards, is really what's spurred this. Before that, it was possible to do these projects, and many people did, but you had to have people interfacing perhaps through their desktop computer or through a laptop. It's more inconvenient, whereas now we can have mobile phones, we can have bespoke apps that allow people to upload their data, allow us to take the data off very, very easily. So it's the rise really of smartphones particularly that's led to this massive rise in citizen science as an approach. I thought I'd briefly talk about one of the citizen science projects I've been involved with. This was a project about 5 years ago when we looked at house spiders. It's particularly relevant this time of year because it's autumn, and during autumn we see this rise in the number of people that get very excited, and that's not always excited, actually sometimes quite angry, and sometimes quite scared about the appearance of these large house spiders, Tegenaria and other genera that appear in people's houses. And we realized looking around that actually, although this is a well-known phenomenon, there's actually not very much information, or at least there wasn't, in terms of the national picture. When do they emerge first? Do we see a sort of north-south kind of movement of these emergencies as autumn progresses? What sort of spiders are involved? How long does spider season, as it's become known on social media, go on for, and so on? And of course, the reason why there wasn't that national information is because up until recently, it's not really been a very cost-effective way or even possible way to do it. So what we did was we generated a very basic app. It was very, very straightforward, and also used a web-based survey using SurveyMonkey for people to go online when they've seen a spider in their home. They could go online, they could record all kinds of information about it, the sex of the spider, where it was in the house, the time, the date, and so on. Now, each individual record isn't particularly important, but when you get tens of thousands of people sending those records in across time, you can start to get really quite important information. But key to that is getting those thousands of people involved. And we were quite fortunate, actually. It was a very slow news week when we let the press release out, and the Daily Star ran it as a front page, which was quite bizarre. There was just a giant picture of a spider, Attack of the Giant Spiders. I don't know where they got all this stuff from, but actually when you turn the page to the article, there was really quite a good article talking about our project, why it was important, why spiders are amazing, and obviously the Daily Star having that on the front page attracted lots of other attention too, and we ended up being featured in most of the UK press, and that got us loads and loads of people downloading the app and taking part, and that was what was really key to that particular project. It's getting that level of engagement so that we can really cover the country across the period of time. Yeah, we were able to get quite a lot of records. Lots of people downloaded the app. Of course, not everyone that downloaded the app then recorded a spider. And was that because they didn't see a spider? Actually, very useful information that's quite hard to get sometimes. Or was it because they lost out and became disengaged, they weren't interested, they forgot about the app or whatever? We don't know. That's one of the limitations of this approach. But we were able to get more than 10,000 records, and after a little bit of cleaning, we were able to get all kinds of interesting information. So this is just a sort of flavor of some of the things that you can get from this type of project. We see this lovely decay here of house spider emergence. They start sort of round about the third week of August, which was pretty much right this time of year as well. And then they peak kind of late September, and then we see this lovely decay away where actually we don't see them anymore. And more than 80% of them were male, which confirms the idea that most of the spiders we see wandering around are actually males looking for females. It's the mating season. It's the males that disperse, and their dispersal just brings them into interesting habitat for them, which also happens to be our front rooms and so on. So that's what we were able to find. We were able to look at the timing, which was quite interesting. This is a sort of circular plot. The average time there is about 7:35. Now, it might be quite tempting to say, well, that really corresponds to when people sit down. In fact, it corresponds to when EastEnders starts on some nights, and Coronation Street and other things. It's a kind of prime time for people to be sat down looking around or being in front of the telly perhaps, and then seeing something walk across in front of them. But actually, because we got lots of data from lots of people, and we were able to get lots of locations of rooms, we're able to test that hypothesis and see whether or not spiders were more likely to be seen in certain locations through the day, which would correlate with extra activity and so on. And actually, that wasn't the case. So this seems to be a reflection of spider ecology rather than human ecology. But that is always a problem when you're looking at citizen science. Sometimes you're actually finding out quite a lot about the citizens and not so much about the science you're trying to investigate. So it can be a bit of a tricky one to disentangle. And then we collected all sorts of information about spiders. I put this up really if you want to avoid seeing spiders. You can have a look. You can have a look at when the fewest sightings were and the best time of the day to be there. Walls seem to be less common than floors and so on. But yeah, out in the conservatory, reasonably rare to see. But you can get all sorts of information from this once you get the large numbers of people taking part. Speaking of which, how do you take part in citizen science? I was going to put up a few citizen science projects that are ongoing. There are actually so many of them now that it becomes quite confusing. In fact, I do an exercise with some master's students here where we try and sort of take a snapshot of the landscape, the citizen science of the landscape at the moment. And the last couple of years, one of the students said it made them feel sick because there were just so many projects and it can be quite hard to sort of get a handle on it. If you search Citizen Science Projects UK, they're on Google, you actually come up with some really useful hits early on. So there's Do Something Great, which is a citizen science portal through the BBC. The Natural History Museum has a citizen science portal. CEH, I mentioned earlier, with the UK Ladybird Survey and the Plant Tracker app, they've got a series of citizen science projects you can get involved with if you're interested in that side of things. Nesta is a very good project to get involved with. Saga actually do have a citizen science link. The British Science Association, all sorts of other organisations. So there's lots and lots of ways to get involved with citizen science. Also look up Zooniverse, Z-O-O-Niverse, and you can find all sorts of projects through them too. So if you want to get involved with science and you want to get involved with all kinds of ways of looking at it, whether it's the biological, the ecological, which I've mostly spoken about, or any of the other wealth of citizen science projects, there is really you're spoilt for choice at the moment. Whether it's categorizing galaxies, finding penguin colonies from satellites, seabird monitoring, ocean temperature processing. There's even some citizen science projects linked to the UK cancer research organisations that allow you to start looking at things like genetics. So there's an incredible number of different projects you can get involved with. Moving into the future then, we've seen this big rise of citizen science through very, very simply the rise of the smartphone. What are we going to see in the future? Well, I think we're going to make much more complex use of citizens, and we're already starting to see this now. Not just asking people, well, when did you see this, or would you mind doing this task, but actually bringing people along and thinking of people much more as research partners and having different levels of engagement. To give you an idea, the big Wasp Survey, we have now a sort of subset of volunteers who helped us to develop some online identification tools and test them. We've got volunteers who are willing to put out 2 or more traps. We've got people who are willing to put out additional traps. And we've got these differing levels of engagement throughout the project. That, I think, is what we're going to see developing much more through these citizen science projects. Not just a single question and a single approach, but actually the development almost of a sort of research consortium where we start to develop much more interesting research ideas, and we start to direct action a lot more. We start to say to people, okay, that's brilliant that you've done this, but would you mind, since you live in this particular area and you're interested in it, could you, for example, go to this location and see if there's anything there? Or could you look at these particular set of galaxy pictures because you've shown an aptitude for doing that sort of identification work? So I think we're going to see a much more meaningful relationship between sort of the citizen and the science developing. And I think we may also start to see much more, if you like, passive citizen science and citizen sensing. We all carry around with us now smartphones with microphones and cameras. Wearable technology hasn't quite taken off. This was Google Lens here, which was going to be the next big thing not that long ago and has kind of vanished without trace. But over the coming years, I'm sure that we're going to see more wearable technology and more sort of always on sensing technology about us, which we'll be able to make all sorts of use of. I mean, for example, a microphone on your smartphone, if it was able to be used by an app, we could record birdsong as you walk around. You wouldn't even be aware of the fact that it was happening. And if we knew your location and we knew other people's location, we could triangulate certain bird songs. We could work out what birds were singing. We could infer their territories and all kinds of other things by this remote sensing approach. And we're not really there yet. but I think that's probably where we're going to be looking at moving over the next sort of decade or so, if that type of technology is advancing as the way it is, in the way it is. And then, of course, we've also got all sorts of options and opportunities available to us from the sorts of things that people like to upload. And this is already happening to a certain extent. So there's a picture here of a spotted hyena, there's a whale shark. Those are individual animals that are identifiable by their characteristic spot pattern or their leg markings and so on. You can actually identify those individuals, and if you were to take a photograph of them, for example, and geotag it, and someone else took a photograph a few weeks later and it's geotagged, and you could have some AI system automatically identifying and working out which animals which, you could start to put together all kinds of interesting distribution maps, for example. That's just one example of how this type of approach could work, and that's quite interesting really, because that might be an example of using data, in this case a photograph that's been uploaded by a citizen, that you then as a scientist are making use of because it happens to be on Instagram or on Facebook, but actually the citizen hasn't uploaded it for that scientific purpose. And one of the things that's starting to vex people now, and I think it should, and I think it's something we need to explore much more, are some of the ethics behind citizen science. How far can we go? What permissions do we need to make use of data? What rights do the citizens have that take part in these projects? What are the responsibilities of the scientists that are involved in this, in terms of, for example, publishing papers that come from citizen science projects open access so that everyone can get the data that they've helped to contribute to. These things are a work in progress, but they are a work in progress, and people are thinking very deeply and very hard about this, because as citizen science becomes normalized as a way of gathering data in lots of different areas, it is something that we're going to need to think about more and more. But finally, to end almost where I began, it's very tempting to get carried away with sort of AI and technology and the future and where we might go and all of the successes that we've had. But it's always important to stress that underpinning any successful citizen science project, not just the citizens who are absolutely invaluable and without whom none of these projects could go ahead, but also the science. And fundamentally, science is built on these 5 very, very important stages. And I think they're worth locking into your memory, because this is the basis of science. You see something, you smell something, you hear something, you have some observation, you ask questions about it. That's the key stage, right? That's what kids are brilliant at. We tend to lose that skill a little bit, and then we have to relearn it as adults. And from that, we start coming up with our ideas, our hypotheses, and they start to make predictions. And then we come up with all these beautiful and elegant ways to test them, but fundamentally it's those 5 steps that underpin it. And so don't get carried away with the technology. Citizen science fundamentally is good science, linked to the tremendous generosity, I think, of the general public in getting involved. And I've certainly been very, very grateful in some of the citizen science projects that I've been doing for everyone that's contributed data. It's an amazing thing. I've run citizen science projects where I've forgotten to put in data points to my own project, and I get to the end of it and think, I never actually recorded that point. That was a bit foolish. And then I look and there's 10,000 people, recording spiders in their own home. So it's that generosity, I think, of the public linked to that science that makes citizen science such a success. Thank you.